Hi there, and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by the Cyber Hut and Signal. My name is Simon Moffatt. I'm founder and research analyst at the Cyber Hut. With me is Mat Hamlin from Signal. Matt, how are we doing?
Good. How are you? Matt Hamlin, Director of Product Marketing at Signal. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Hi, Matt. Well, we'll do some intros in a second. I guess a little bit of housekeeping before we dive into today's fascinating topic, looking at continuous identity. Everybody is obviously globally muted today, but we do have the Q&A functionality available. So please use that as we go through today's content, and we will leave some time at the end to answer any specific questions. We can try and weave those in to today's conversation as well. And of course, this is being recorded, so you will have access to that on demand to watch at a time of your choosing or share with your colleagues in the future. But today's topic, always on, always aware, building a continuous identity strategy. It's an area which the Cyber Hut has been researching for a good sort of 12 months or so. There's been lots of sort of subtle moves within the market and within industry to move towards something more dynamic and more responsive. And there's certainly more inquiry time being spent on this. There's more questions being asked around what this is, how to operate, how can we solve some of our sort of legacy identity deployment patterns. So absolutely thrilled to be digging into this topic in a bit more detail. My name is Simon Moffatt. I'm founder analyst at the Cyber Hut. Been fortunate to be in identity for a number of years, nearly 25 in fact, which is a little bit scary. And identity has never been as important as it is today, empowering not only productivity, but also things like security, integration with things like cloud, mobile, and obviously now more latterly things like AI as well. It's certainly made identity much more sort of central and strategic to how the modern enterprise functions. And it's really, I feel a bit of a privilege really to still be in the industry and seeing all of that change over that period. And I guess Matt, yourself as well, I know you've been around for quite a while, so maybe sort of a quick intro to yourself and a bit of your backstory perhaps, and we can get started into today's content.
Yeah, thanks. So I only have 20 years on identity. You and I got started at the same time, I think, but I took a little 5-year step out to do some backup recovery and security at a different company. But yeah, it looks like I think we joined the industry about the same time, and we had some overlap, right, over at Sun Microsystems years ago. But yeah, across my 20 years, I've had the privilege of working at a number of vendors and covered just about every area of identity over that time, starting with provisioning, and then you and I had some overlap with role mining, role management, access certification, and then for a while, I spent some time at Salesforce on their platform identity, making sure that all access was controlled really well. So a lot of time on authentication and MFA, and now over at Signal, focused on authorization. So I've been very lucky in my career to be able to cover a lot of these areas and listen to a lot of customers, try to understand their problems better.
That's fantastic. I think it's all technologies change, don't they? And they evolve, and they obviously some technologies disappear. I think it's just fantastic really to see identity sort of move away from being the sort of LDAP thing of 20 odd years ago, where it was sort of operations and it was just this guy in the corner, and I was that guy in the corner doing directory services stuff, and suddenly it sort of bloomed and blossomed to where it is today, and it still continues to surprise me the sort of directions it goes in. And today's agenda, we're hopefully going to cover some of those new directions. Really, I want to start off just, I guess, understanding a little bit about where we are and understand some of that history and legacy, I suppose, around point in time identity and access management, and how technologies were designed, how they were used, the isolation around some of those technologies, and really trying to make that more enabled, more dynamic, going from something that was static to something more smart, informed, and able to respond to not only external cyber threat, but also the business requirements around risk and integration as well, and sort of end up a little bit understanding a bit more about sort of runtime risk and how we can leverage some of those existing sort of risk signals or data signals within our identity world. And as I said earlier, it is really becoming quite a prescient problem. I think identities, it is becoming more important. It is strategic to enable things like zero trust, absolutely productivity and governance and access to the right systems. But we have a whole host of other things to deal with. Humans, we have non-humans, we have migration to the cloud, which sort of hasn't really completed. We're still sort of hybrid, I think, in our landscape there. And identity is now suddenly, it's being metriced, if you like, or from a success perspective, our success, isn't it? It's empowering things like zero trust and just-in-time access, zero standing permissions, and sort of integrating with the broader security ecosystem, which I think we'll probably uncover a little bit more in detail today. So I want to start off not necessarily describing identity in a bad way, but it does need to evolve, and there's a lot of sort of excellent knowledge and maturity and concepts we've built up over the past probably sort of 3 decades, really. The sort of late 90s, I guess, where we sort of started to commercially deploy things like directory services, and then a bit of single sign-on and access request and review that you mentioned there earlier as well. And that's great. We've deployed a lot of software over the past 20 odd years, and I think some of that is good. It does a good thing, but equally things evolve, and many organizations are really stuck in this sort of assurance trap, aren't they? I think around there's multiple disconnections I want to sort of pull out here, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this as well, Matt. Around, we're very familiar with things like identity verification and validation, step up authentication, and sort of these sort of big barriers to onboarding and big barriers to sort of logging into systems based on risk. And these are great. They do the basic security control points, but over time, and this could be relating to the time a user is logged into a system, like things like session lifetimes and things, or it could well be the time a user is working on a project and has permissions. And if you look at the time versus the assurance, there's always this sort of continual degradation. The longer somebody's logged in, clearly the bigger the vulnerability to their session could be. The longer somebody has standing permissions or has been associated with roles and groups, etc., that becomes more of an attack surface as well. So we have this continual slide. But the other thing I want to sort of briefly mention is that sort of disconnect as well between the identity data, profiles, permissions, policies, and the things that we sort of manage from a governance perspective, and then all of the runtime world around authentication, policy enforcement, access control. They're often very disconnected. And I want to sort of throw this just to you initially, what your immediate thoughts are on that disconnect. Am I scared? Is this a bit of a scare story, or is this just an inevitability of this sort of 2-3 decades worth of identity investment we've all made?
Sure. Thanks. I mean, I definitely think it's an inflection point, an exciting time in our market. I think identity and enterprise identity especially move very slowly. But you see over the years, most organizations will focus on the areas that they're required to focus on, right? For so many years, the initial focus was just on operational efficiency, right? So all the way back to my Sun Identity Manager days, right? Like Sun Identity Manager, it provisioned accounts. It really didn't even provision entitlements, right? It was about when somebody joins the organization, what systems they need access to, right? And there was a little bit of, customizations and evolution to say, well, let's create accounts for these folks on these systems, but maybe we could also put them in a role or give them a little bit of entitlements. But fundamentally, the origins of user provisioning were purely operational, just to make sure that you could get people some level of access, base level access, and get started on their daily tasks before they quickly ask the return their organization, right? And so then you see it evolved again, right? There was a shift in the market. There was regulatory demands, right? SOX 404 happened, and so organizations were held to account, right? It was a financial control, but in that it said, organizations must ensure that users only have access to the systems of data required to do their job, that one little sentence, forced organizations to do a lot, to really spend some time on that area, because creating accounts is one thing, but only the things they need to have access to their job. Now you're getting into a little bit more granular, down to entitlements. What can I do inside of a system? So that sort of gave birth to the areas that we focused on, right? So enterprise role management and mining, to try to understand exactly what a person should have in certain systems at certain times, depending on geography or whatever might be. It also gave rise to access certifications, right? So every quarter or every year, taking a look at who has access to what, making sure that you can prove that people only have access to what they need to have access to. So back to your point, right? So a history of identity management over the last 3 decades, start off very operational and moved into more of a compliance standpoint, where again, organizations are focused on what they had to focus on, right? So they were required to meet their compliance obligations. So what we ended up with joiner, mover, leaver operations. When somebody joins the organization, what access do they have? Hopefully we've, folks evolved over time to sort of build out some level of business roles and technical roles to make that process efficient and effective and correct. When they change roles in the organization, they move, really should deprovision access and add access. We still know that even today, that probably doesn't happen, right? Too often still, when you change roles, you get more access. And you have the classic access collector, that the longer they're in the organization, to your point, your graph, right? You just have more and more access, and then leavers. So we got better at those functions. And then I think there's some evolution into starting to get a little bit more into identity as a security control. Obviously, they're all security controls, but the shift happened, I think, where we wanted to make sure that we were doing a little bit more checking, at least at the front door. So to your point, the authentication step, right? We sort of focused on that for a few years. Let's get MFA in place. Let's really make sure that we know who they are. Maybe even moving back to the joiner, right? There's a time in the industry where we spent on identity proofing, right? When we hire this person, let's really make sure we know who they are and those steps. So we've evolved there. But now we're to a point to where we need to focus a lot more on what's happening right now, right? What's happening in real time. Those sort of 4 points of checking, right? Joiner, mover, leaver, login aren't quite cutting it anymore. I think it's a good opportunity for us to refocus, mainly driven by, we have these ongoing and increasing security threats. So moving from sort of operational to compliance. So now there's a shift. There's a shift more on security as we move to cloud. Identity is new security perimeter. Everyone always says that, right? But I think it's coming true. And what I see is a lot more security teams and identity teams coming together. So
I think there's lots to unpick in that. I think there's definitely people operate via incentives, and identity. I guess part of that was compliance led. People had as you mentioned, things like SOX and other in that sort of financial services world, and it was a case of, right, well, identity is doing this sort of plumbing thing. It's connecting systems, and there's the productivity gain. There's a measurable thing to make sure both staff and maybe privileged accounts, are provisioned effectively, rapidly. You don't want staff sitting around for days on end, waiting to be set up on systems and trying to gain access to things. And obviously, if you speed those things up, this is a tangible cost there, or a tangible saving there, to say, look, well, I can, give my staff who are getting paid, big dollars, if they can be on board within a couple of hours versus a few days and weeks. Clearly, there's a saving there. And I think, if we talk about sort of JML, really well understood, it's well designed, lots of workflows and processes, but as you say, it wasn't really built for security in mind. And that isn't a criticism. That's just ultimately it's a fact, really. It was there for productivity, amplified with maybe some sort of compliance and productivity wrapped together. But ultimately, it wasn't feeding those security metrics around things like discovery and controls assurance and those sorts of things. And you talk about sort of data breaches, and you can Google. There's probably been another one today from some unlucky company somewhere, and they often have those core pillars of identity deployed. So maybe 2, 3, 4 different MFA systems, probably due to like consolidation issues or usability issues or whatever. Yes, probably got a good IDP or multiple for federation and things, but they still get breached. They still have issues, and maybe it's visibility, maybe it's detection, and that sort of thing. And I think as identity does take on, I guess, more responsibility, it does need to be more in tune with what the business is trying to achieve. And I think if you start looking at things like, hyper competitive markets and challenger markets and these sorts of things, you don't want identity insecurity to be the thing which holds those sort of products and services back. And I think there's maybe a little bit of a risk at the minute around maybe the rise of agentic AI and this sort of stuff, where the innovation of the business is very rapid, and what you don't want is your identity and security layers to be either seen as being slow and too controlling and holding things back, or they just get circumvented. I think there's a little bit of a risk there if you aren't sort of evolving your identity stack and making it more dynamic, making it more security focused. There is a risk, isn't there, that both the degradation continues and also the gap possibly between data and runtime gets further apart. And there's some good things there, but I think equally, I think we do need to sort of acknowledge we do need to sort of do things a little bit differently. And that's when I sort of introduced this idea from, we've got these pillars of identity capability, often tied to static business process, often tied to these sort of unmovable feats, if you like, of joiner, mover, lever, change, and other. And I think it's how can we make this smarter? And it's definitely an evolution, isn't it? It's not a revolution. I don't want to say we have to throw everything into the bin, but I think we do need to start considering how we can make our identity world smarter. And I think that it's very clear that there are some key pillars you need within your identity world: IDP, federation, strong MFA, passwordless, centralized policy management for authorization, looking at things like posture and hygiene, continual compliance. These are all brilliant, and they are needed and they need to be deployed effectively. But I think there's this layer above, and I think this is where we can start to talk about augmentation, integration with some of those existing data sources. And I think this is where it's the classic thing, isn't it, to me, of 1 + 1 = 5. We have existing really good sources of information within the enterprise, ticketing systems, configuration management, all of our identity stack, and it's been able to leverage that in adding it into the identity world. To me, I think I want to pull you in here again. We have this information, don't we, in the enterprise? Is it just a case of plugging it in and bubbling this stuff to the surface?
Yes.
Simple as that.
So simple, right? Let's just plug it in. No, I think it's a good point, right? We are identity teams and security teams both are under extreme pressure from the business. They always want to move faster, and we want to make sure it's secure. Right. There's this natural tension that happens in every organization to where, identity or security practices need to be strong, need to be well implemented, but we can't slow the business down. Right. That has material impact on the company. And so there's always this balance we've had for forever in the industry. On the, moving from static to smarter, I agree. We're getting to a place where we need to start looking at implementing identity the way that we do sort of in real life, right? Which is we have these interactions with people, or we have these interactions with businesses to where we're following some natural zero trust policies, if that makes sense. So zero trust, right? The whole point of zero trust is that we trust no one, and that we check and we verify that they are who they say they are, and they have access to things. Originally it was the network layer, don't trust anyone there, but we're moving to sort of a more zero trust and zero standing privilege model on the identity side, to where at the end of the day, the goal is to be much more frequent with validating who the person is, why they're here, what they're trying to do, and have that be a continual process, as opposed to this old joiner, mover, lever, where you get access to a thing forever, right? That's a mover, lever potentially, but it's very point in time. So now we want to have these interactions that are much more contextual. And to your point, the data is in the organization somewhere, right? So So a human example, right? So if I went to my company's data center on a Sunday and knocked on the door and said, "Hey, can I get into the data center? I got computers in there." They would do a lot of things, right? They would authenticate me. They would check to make sure I am who I say that I am. Right? They would probably do a validation. They'd probably call somebody to say, "Hey, is this guy supposed to be here?" If they have work logs or processes in place, they would check the context right then. Is this a person supposed to be here right now? Um, is there any access that they're supposed to have? Can they get access to rack one but not rack two? So like these daily interactions that we have with individuals are very contextual, right? Even in your personal life, right? Somebody comes to the door to fix your air conditioner and they knock and you sort of authenticate that, oh yeah, I knew they were supposed to be here today. There's some context. They're wearing the uniform. There's some authentication. They walked over and started working on my hot water heater. Wait a minute, they're the air conditioning person. Why are they touching my hot water heater? So like we have these contextual decisions around trust all the time. And so that's, we have the opportunity now to bring some of that into our corporate and enterprise identity practices, right? And so the way that I often talk about it is that we need to start injecting these contextual decisions, policies at the control points that we have available to us, right? When somebody logs into a system or logs into SSO, right after they log in, we know they'll take an action. I'm trying to go to AWS, or I'm trying to, through my single sign-on, go to Salesforce, whatever it might be. There's an opportunity there. There's a control point where you can make some policy decisions, right? Integrate with the service that can do those contextual policy decisions. Same thing in other areas. If I'm a non-human identity and I'm trying to access an API, if I'm going through an API gateway, there's an authorization that's a control point where I can try to make this smart decisions about whether this non-human identity is supposed to access this system at this time based off of context. To look at things like, to your point, for humans, pager duty schedules or security signals from your XDR system. We want to really understand who this person is, why they're here right now, and what they're trying to do right now, and use that information that is available in the organization. The data is there, right? We just need to get it into the policies and enforce them at the right points. And so, at the end of the day, I think we're moving to a place where much more frequent checks in the interactions that we have between humans and systems, that's where we need to go.
It's some really, really subtle things there. I really want to pick up on that sort of frequency and the sort of definition of context. But before I sort of dive in with that, there was a quick question come through the channel there, and asking about we talk about control points and sort of decision making, and we get quite focused around sort of coarse-grained and fine-grained authorization and the sort of level of how fine-grained we can. And the question is really focused about, how fine-grained can we go based on this sort of staticky set of person and org data. My view would be probably not very fine-grained, because it sounds quite big, quite chunky. But what's your sort of view there?
I agree. I think that when we're talking about making this shift to more frequent decisions about access, we are moving from static to sort of a more coarse grade, right? So if you're bringing in that business context and the security context, we don't need to verify those things on every time someone clicks a button or every time somebody accesses a particular file, right? It's coarse grained in that we want to make sure that this person should be here at this moment and has certain rights on this system at this time. And then if those conditions change, we want to take that away. But I think you're right. I think fine-grained controls for the near term will still be isolated into the applications themselves, right? So if you look at something like a Google Drive, right? Like under the covers, Zanzibar that does fine-grained authorization. It's about sharing of particular objects. It's about data structures and who can access these tiny little pieces of information inside the application. That I think fine-grained is going to live in those applications for a while. We're just trying to get from static join, move, lever, and on the other side we have these sort of in-app super fine-grained things, and so we're trying to bridge the gap between those to get closer to understanding who needs access at this time to what things for what reasons. I think coarse grained is also the target at the moment.
Yeah, no, fascinating stuff there. And it's I think that frequency of checking is interesting as well, isn't it? I think that sort of, I guess it's the doctrine of zero trust around trying to collapse the gaps around where you do your control points in your decision making. And it's, instead of having that big, huge barrier during authentication or maybe during onboarding, and then you don't do any checks for 2-3 hours, 2-3 days, or whatever it could be afterwards. As you said, doing that more, interjecting the control points more frequently. And I think as well, that context is really important. I think it gives some really great examples there. And I think it is you're sort of trying to win this asymmetric information battle, aren't we, around should we give access, should we not, should we allow access, should we not? And I think those sort of fine-grained or micro interruptions, you need more information to do that. You need to be more informed as a sort of decision-making engine. I think it's, in my head, you can sort of split that into the sort of attribution side and say, right, okay, I know it's Simon, we did onboarding, we did IDV, we did whatever, liveness checks is great. Then you want to tie that into authentication to make sure I haven't been impersonated. But equally, even if the attribution is correct, should I have access to do that thing? As you said, out of context on a Sunday, going to the data center, and I may well be the correct person, but I shouldn't necessarily have the permissions or the ability to do so, unless, of course, the context indicates it's an emergency and there's a ticket open, there's a P1 priority, and your CDN's gone down or whatever, and I have to be into the data center. So that you need more information, don't we? We need more data to make more informed decisions. I think you look here around the sort of ITM tools, but also the same configuration management, integrating both broader and deeper to that cyber world around threat intelligence, understanding things like the devices, our mobile devices, which we use to log in, and characteristics of that mobile device, operating system. Is it rooted? Does that have any malicious apps on there, which just maybe not in its entirety will stop my access, but contributes to that context, doesn't it? And I think it's all of those, to me, those sort of pink boxes are all just contributing to our sort of signals, no pun intended there, around our signals intelligence, around how our platforms can make more informed decisions. And I guess I want to sort of roll on to the next aspect, really, is to what does that give us? And there's a couple of things I want to sort of pull out here. I think we are, I guess, both as an industry and our sort of knowledge around the assurance levels associated with identity onboarding and also the authentication aspect. And we talk about, there's the NIST guidelines there, which do a superb job of sort of articulating how to onboard somebody and the information you need and in-person checks and that sort of stuff. And then we talk about authentication, the different types of authentication factors we may leverage, inherence and possession factors, and this, which is great. But equally, I think we also need to extend those concepts to assurance at all parts of this identity lifecycle or identity journey. And okay, I've authenticated, but is the session being protected? Is the session have enough context around it? I may have an access token or a cookie with certain permissions in there, but should I be using those permissions right now on that system under the particular context? And again, going right the way down through to the particular data I want to access or the transaction that I want to complete. And I think it just conceptually, to me, it's sort of extending this assurance concept to all parts of this identity lifecycle. Is this too big a goal, do you think, or are these sorts of things, getting to just in time and zero standing, are these within our grasp now, do you think, if we sort of add in this additional context?
I think so. And I think we have a real opportunity to start small and start slowly. And most of what we've been talking about so far has been all preventative control, right? Like, we need to be better about making sure people are authorized to take the actions at the point of login, right? After login, after we've done all the authentication, now we're deciding on this service, what should this person be able to do preventatively. But there are, I think maybe we'll talk about this in a minute, but like the other piece of that is the reactive controls, right? Which is I'd call actually active and then reactive. So the context that we're talking about, the policies that we're making, that we're deciding upon, so whether this person should have access to do this thing on this system right now, we definitely want to control that at the front door. But we also have opportunities to do some of that, even coarse grained inside the application as well, right? So are they taking a privileged action, right? That's an opportunity that we've implemented, we in the industry, we'd say, oh, we step off authentication. We need to say, oh, they're doing the privileged action. Let's make sure they really are who they say they are. And that's the person sitting at the desk right now. No one's sat at their desk, right? So that's control we put in place. That's also an opportunity for us to go double check other contextual information, right? Is their device being compromised? Are they still on duty? They still have an open incident. So there's active. And the last one is sort of the reactive, right? Continuous identity, the way I define it, is giving someone access when there's an active business need, not before and not after, right? So anytime that those contextual conditions change, you're going to have users have active sessions. We've authenticated them. We've authorized them with some of these great contextual controls to get a session. But what happens when conditions change, right? What happens when that ticket closes or your XDR system says that your device is out of compliance, right? How do we go and orchestrate removing those sessions? So all important pieces that are inside of what I would call continuous identity holistically. And I think there are small steps that we can take. For example, if you simply want to start looking at device compliance across these different places, that's a great first step, right? You have an XDR system that's in place, whether that's Intune or CrowdStrike or Jamf or whatever it might be. You could start pulling that information in and correlating it with identities across your IAM systems, and then implementing those checks, those control points after somebody logs in. They're trying to with single sign-on. They're transitioning themselves, they've navigated to AWS or some other cloud infrastructure. At that point, let's double check with my XDR system. Are there any open risks right now? So there's some very small steps that you can take to add in a little bit of context, increase your security very, very quickly. The other thing that I would suggest folks do is, put your toe in the water and try to implement some of these in a simulated fashion. I always tell the story. I don't know if it's real or not, actually, but I live in Texas, and Texas A&M University. There's a story that says, hey, when they build new buildings, they don't actually put sidewalks in. They watch and figure out where the paths get drawn by people walking around, and then they put sidewalks there, right? And so I think we have an opportunity to do that here as well. Work with a vendor who can help you implement some of these policies at these control points and just put it in simulation mode, right? Just watch the logs. This person is trying to access this system at this time. We did a policy check, and you can just log it. We would let this person through, or we would not have let this person through for these reasons. So there's an opportunity to take a few steps in the right direction, putting in place some initial policies, and then watch and then learn and see how it's going to impact your organization. I think there's a lot of concern and fear as we move. Anytime you add security teams are always worried that they're going to impact the business. So more opportunities to instill that confidence, or try to really understand what's going to happen when you turn this new level of security live. What impact is it going to have on individual users? If we do inadvertently block somebody because of policy, what's the remediation path for that? So, take a few steps, pick a simple policy, pick one, try to implement it, and then watch, see what's going on in the environment, tune it, and then take that first step, turn it on, increase your security.
That seems great advice there. I was going to dive into one of the questions, and you sort of answered that question already, actually, around how does this sort of contextual decision making shape the organisation from an identity point of view. I think it's great that when you're looking at transformational change, which I think this really is, you do want to start small, and that sidewalk analogy is fabulous. I'm not quite sure whether that was how popular that perhaps was, but I think getting to that end goal, it's pragmatic, isn't it? We've all seen these situations where you have the paths and the sidewalks, and they get circumvented, and the shortcut gets created anyway, or the gate gets traversed and stuff. So I think observation, as you say, sort of read-only mode, in the sense of analysing and understanding, is really, really good. But I think the other one is, it is that fear of getting it wrong, which I think identity, unfortunately, has had a bit of a bad reputation with in the past. And by that, I mean, things like role mining and role analysis, and you end up with this role explosion phenomenon, or AD groups explosion, because you start creating more and more permissions because you're not quite sure what these existing groups are doing. There's no descriptions, there's no owners, and you're sort of scared to take them away. Crikey, there's one person in this role, and if I take it away, perhaps they can't do their job, and maybe they're really important, and it's not worth the hassle. So you end up with this proliferation of things. And I think there's definitely a fear of removing access, removing accounts, rotating credentials, changing things, changing permissions and access tokens, because of the impact it may have on production systems. So I think read-only observing is really great. I think as well, if you make a change or a simulation, just be able to roll something back as well, I think. One other quick question while we're here. Pat asked there, I think this is probably the previous slide actually, but I don't see an authoritative source like an HR system in there. Is this also part of the design? I think it is. I think from my point of view, and look at your opinion there, Matt, to me, it is part of the design. I think it's often assumed it's there. I think possibly the auth source, it does alter, I think, in organizations. Sometimes it filters down, and the IGA system sometimes ends up being the authoritative source, which I guess there's pros and cons to that. But I guess, Matt, what's your view here? Is the HR system still got a huge role to play?
Absolutely, right. I think, especially historically, or with currently with IGA solutions, absolutely right, because the HR system is the authoritative source often for identities. Now, what you'll see in most organizations that they'll have 2, 3, 4, 5 authoritative HR systems, right? Because you've got contractor databases, you've acquired 3 companies over the last 5 years. Like, you end up having a lot of these authoritative sources that are HR, but it is really important, right? Because identity, especially sort of the coarse-grained role-based side of the world, it's tied to title, right? It's tied to your location potentially, right? I mean, we used to, when we were doing role mining years ago, right? That was a huge piece of the puzzle. What's this person's title? What department are they in? What location, what country are they in, right? Those would all go into deciding what business and technical roles that they would have as their birthright access, or even full access in their sort of joiner process. And so I think those are still really, really important. I think there's also a role to play in continuous identity and contextual authorization. I have a demo where when somebody's trying to access a certain system, you can do a live contextual check to make sure that in the HR system, they are a U.S. citizen located within the U.S., right? Or whatever other data that might be in there that is interesting to making these contextual decisions. So I do think HR systems play a big role, both in, sort of birthright and IGA flows, as well as contextual real-time decisions.
Yeah. No, I agree. I don't see that being too disconnected today and in the future as well. So let's change gears a little bit and sort of take this boat home a little bit around how do we get there. I think we sort of know identity needs to change. I think the sort of architectural patterns needs to change. And yes, we have some good building blocks, whatever that's IGA or onboarding systems and those existing workflows, absolutely super. But I think we do need to do something different. We do need to make it more in tune with both the risk appetite and obviously the business requirements as well. And there's a couple of things I want to pull out here. One is, we've talked a lot about sort of context, and that context can come from various different sources. And what does that allow us to do? And there's definitely one thing which is certainly emerging in both B2E and B2C, actually, identity. And around risk doesn't stand still. It's a very dynamic, fluctuating thing. I don't just necessarily mean, an immediate cyber threat has just emerged, or a particular sort of MITRE attack has become more prolific, or whatever it is. But the risk appetite of the business changes as well, be that maybe they're going into a merger and acquisition, maybe they want to launch a new product to market, maybe their competitor has just launched a new product to market, and that then influences your as you said earlier, the speed of the business. The business needs to do things, and the risk and security aspects can't slow that down. But I think that contextual aspect gives us, we can do more from a response point of view, and it isn't just allow, deny, black and white, block, or let somebody in. We can do more things, and that improves usability. It improves the ability for someone to complete a task, even if their risk may be elevating in there. But we also have some new building blocks, don't we? Things like shared signals, continuous access eval profile. We have some new building blocks here which we can leverage and use. And I think that, to me, it does allow us to get to this more fine-grained ability to respond, not just if something really, really bad happens, but actually maybe if there's just a combination of signals or a combination of contextual events, and we can start to do things like reduce session lifetime perhaps, or take someone's access from being read and write to being read only because maybe they're on a public Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or something. So to me, it's about sharing risk, isn't it? Is that the basic building block? Is that what the likes of sort of CAPE and SSF are really trying to achieve?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're seeing much stronger convergence of security teams and identity teams, security products and identity products. I think that's where we're, as an industry, being pulled, right? The threat landscape continues to go up. With AI being able to move at machine speed, we all probably saw the Anthropic-driven breach attack this past week. There's a demand on organizations to make sure that their security keeps pace with the threats that are out there. So many organizations have increased their budgets for security, but if you continue to improve your security, identify your threat signals or threat patterns that might be there, you're looking at IP ranges and rate of requests. We're putting in all these controls on the security side to try to identify risks, based off of behavior. There's a lot of investment in that area. But when you do see a problem, what do? Right? We need to get to a place where the signals or the events that happen that might indicate or do indicate some security threat, that we can share that with the organization, right? You want to be able to very, very quickly respond and react to those security signals. And that's where SSF, Shared Signals Framework, and CAPE, Continuous Access Evaluation Protocol, come into play. And so when, for example, we talked before, right? We have spent a lot of time on preventative controls, right? We want to make sure that when somebody does get access, they get a session into an environment. It's limited to what they need to do. But that session stays alive as long as they keep doing something in the application oftentimes, right? Or as long as they keep refreshing that session. As an industry, we've moved to sort of short-lived tokens and short-lived sessions a little bit, but that has an impact on the business. So what we need to be able to do is, when we give somebody a session, great, give them a session, let them do what they're supposed to do. But we also need to be really responsive and really reactive to these signals that are coming in that changes the conditions that gave them the access in the first place, right? If somebody's device gets compromised, if we believe that this session is tied to a AI attack because the rate of requests across systems is non-human speed, right? It's machine speed. We're like, we figured that out, right? We need to be able to share that signal down and be able to allow the identity stack to react to that, right? Kill the session in the application that's being attacked. Kill the session at the IDP and let it perform single logout if that's in place, right? We can send a request over to the IGA system, like, this account is being attacked, or it's been hijacked. We believe it's been hijacked. Remove all the privileged access and move them into security hold group. Or simply, and once we do those events, then let the security team know, right? And one of the talks I did recently, I sort of said, would it be great, identity team, if when a security event happens, right, the security team figures it out, they figure out there's a breach is occurring or an incident is occurring, they oftentimes Slack you or walk down the hall and say, hey, we have a breach. We think it's this person. What are they doing right now? Where are they logged in? So it's this very manual process of reaction from a security threat to closing off the identity threat. And so, if we get better about this, if we build these integrations based off of these open standards, now your identity systems and services and the whole stack can react to these security threats and signals as they occur. So when a device gets compromised, signal comes over to your identity stack. We can kill sessions, we remove their access. And then when the security team slacks you, walks down the hall, you can be like, yeah, I already took care of it, right? The same system that you're using to detect it told me that it happened, and our systems carried out that remediation immediately. So, and I think that's going to be, a really important and necessary, again, as we move to a place where threats get faster and faster and faster. We have to move at machine speed because the threats are moving at machine speed.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. I think it is. I think you can't respond, can you, unless you are listening. So you need to be able to listen to what's happening. Be able to integrate and pull in the information you need, and then you have that arsenal of responses, whether it is something more sort of permanent and draconian around single logout, and then maybe even disabling the account if you have enough information there, or it just could be something more subtle and more in control until something's really affirmative. But I think it is. I'm going to sort of skip on a little bit here to the you need a framework. You need to be able to integrate with a multitude of different sources, which I think is where your sort of hub aspect is going. And I guess from a policy perspective, there's a couple of things there around, you want to be able to use and leverage that information to access decision making, as well as the sort of more dynamic responses. But I think, to me, you need to be listening in the sense of you need to be integrating and broadening your sort of lens of what you are attempting to analyze. I think that's where we are suddenly talking about IDPs, but also logging systems, device management systems, MDM systems, all of that, the sort of the fabric of managing devices and the underlying infrastructure within the enterprise. So all of that stuff has to be a contributing factor, in my opinion. I think is that where the sort of the hub aspect is looking to get to.
Yeah, agreed. I think to respond to today's threats and to move towards a more real-time, continuous identity posture, we need information from these other places, right? I think identity systems have been fairly siloed for a long time. To the person's question earlier, right? We pull in information from the HR system. We know how to grant access, usually based off of roles, but that doesn't really help us in this real-time environment that we're in. But to make those decisions, we need to have all the policy relevant data available to make those decisions super quickly. So if our policy is, as you see on the screen here, right, account executives can call a certain MCP tool, an AI, to get access to production Salesforce customer records only if they're on a compliant device, right? So you've sort of limited who can do what under what conditions, right? And so to do that, we have to centralize some information. Anything that's policy relevant, we need to have readily available to make these policy decisions very, very quickly. Because one thing we don't want to do is we don't want to pull together, an architecture where you're point to point, right? And for a policy decision like this, we can't make a real-time call out to Workday and to Salesforce and to CrowdStrike like in real time. It's going to slow the business down. So we are moving to a place where we need to build relationships between identities and assets and objects and policies, and do so in a performant way. So I back to the starting simple, figure out what those first 5 policies that you want to enforce are, and then go identify the sources of data for things in that policy, right? The assets, the conditions, the identities, and start pulling those together, because that's where we're headed. I think that to properly enforce the kind of controls that we need now and in the future, you have to bring in that context, both the business context as well as the security context and security signals. And lastly, again, so the same conditions that give you access are the same conditions that should remove your access if they change. So compliant device. Block anyone who's not on a compliant device. If they are on a compliant device, let them in, give them a session. As soon as CrowdStrike, in this case, says their device is non-compliant, it sends a CAPE signal to people, consumers of that, who want to know about that information, and then they can take actions, remove those sessions right.
I think it's fabulous. I think to me as well, it is moving away from that point to point sort of fragility, isn't it? And it is a framework in the sense of it is an ecosystem of I guess providers of information and also sort of consumers of information, sort of traditional pub sub model. And it is moving towards a mesh and not just these very linear point to point system specific things. It's actually saying, look, we have this ability now to link together disparate systems that perhaps had different incentives, different objectives, infrastructure, CMDB, ticketing, or whatever it can be, but actually pulling that together in much more of a sort of super highway of risk sharing. And back to what I was saying earlier, it seems to me that, maybe a small piece of information about the device maybe isn't enough to block them or stop them or trigger MFA, but the stuff with the device and maybe whatever we said there, the Salesforce thing, because it was a high risk event, and the MCP because it was, I don't know, maybe it's a prototype thing. So once you combine that sort of stuff together, it does become and elevates the security angle there. Matt, fabulous chatting here. It's whizzed by. We've gone through whatever, nearly 50 minutes of stuff. We've had a few questions come through. Now is the time, I guess, to bring up one or two more if you so have them. A question I will just bring in though, just while we're waiting for one or two more questions if they do want to come through. We mentioned AI that much, maybe a little bit, but obviously it's buzz, it's the forcing function in the headlines continually. Does AI help or hinder this sort of framework? To me, we need to have more control. We need to have this dynamism, risk sharing, responsiveness. And to me, whether we're talking about people, which we sort of have been, or non-human and even agentic AI, and or what may come in the next, 5-8 years, it seems that this is quite a flexible framework. It doesn't seem too specific to people, but is AI going to sort of help and hinder this sort of model, do you think?
Definitely both, right? I think, well, AI will definitely help the model. I think, the AI being used as a threat actor is also driving the need for this as well. So you have AI on both sides, right? AI will absolutely help with security products that are out there in the world to be better at behavioral analysis and figure out what is right and what is wrong behavior for different types of information. So I think you're going to see a lot more AI across the entire range of security products that are out there. So that'll help us understand better what signals are or when a risk occurs, right? So I think that's going to be a big factor in security products within the attack landscape, right? As like we saw this week, somebody used Anthropic to attack whatever it was, 20 or 30 businesses. And so we're going to see much stronger attacks at machine speed where we can't react fast enough. So I think there's a big threat there. And then we also have this push or this need to sort of also govern and manage AI within the business, within the organization. Right? And so we've done quite a bit of work with the MCP standard to understand how we can properly control access to certain AI functions that get implemented within the organization. Identity plays a huge factor in that, right? I think right now, mostly the identity is like, I have an AI client and I want to access a backend system through an MCP server. And I authenticate as me on the client side, and it bounces through the MCP server into the back end. So I'm really doing all the operations as me. But we see this drive from the business to say, well, I don't want every single person to have to log into everything on the back end. So maybe I'll just give the MCP server privileged access so they can answer all questions. Oof, that's super dangerous. So I think we also need to really, really think through the implications of that. Use those MCP server as a control point. Right. I think you've seen out there almost all the API gateways of the world now support MCP. So if somebody is trying to access an MCP server, we should be able to put an authorization check in there, just like we do today for API calls. When the MCP server calls the backend API, we can also put a check in there. And so I think there's AI has implications across the board, both on threat and prevention and inline. I also think it's a really important piece of context. It's something that we haven't, this notion of continuous identity and real-time contextual decisions is still fairly new in and of itself. But I think as we move forward, the fact that AI is working on my behalf, right? This notion of on behalf of, that's important context that could go into policy. The fact that an account is a NHI, right? It's a non-human ID. That's another piece of context, right? We may want to create and enforce different policies based off of those different actor types. So I think we'll see that being brought in as well. A human could do something, but an AI agent on behalf of that human might not. You might not want them to do that thing that they're trying to keep done. So yeah, AI is going to impact us across the board.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. And maybe it's going to be as you said, the forcing factor to accelerate this identity and security integration and move it from, we need to do something, but actually we have to do something now, because the identity and security sort of landscape is possibly holding things back if you're not thinking more dynamically and being able to think, actually, you know what, we are going to take a risk with deploying AI agents or MCP, but actually we are safe in the knowledge that things do go wrong. We have this framework, we have the sort of belt and braces to be able to respond to things, to be able to observe things, and actually be able to stop bad stuff happening, instead of organizations being very risk averse and thinking, like, actually, we're going to be slow to adopt new technology because we don't have the sort of controls in place. Matt, it's been a fabulous chat. I think a couple of calls to action. Obviously, I think you guys have quite a lot of stuff on the Cape development playground. I've had a good look at that. It's pretty powerful stuff, so you can sort of understand more about how you can integrate some of these technologies, and how you can build out your own sort of landscape of risk sharing. But Matt, thank you for sharing your wisdom, sharing the stories and the journeys that I guess Signal are now empowering for many modern enterprises. Thank you, I guess, to the audience as well. Thank you for interacting with your questions. Hopefully we've got most of those answered. I guess, Matt, any sort of final quick comments now before we wrap things up?
No, just thank you for having me on. It's been a great discussion. Hopefully it's been valuable to folks out there. If you want to get in contact with me, as soon as I hang up here, I'm getting on a plane to go to Identiverse DC. So if you happen to also be at Identiverse DC and want to chat, hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm happy to chat about it. But otherwise, thanks for having me. It's good to talk to you again.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, thank you, Matt. Thank you for an enlightening discussion. I think this is an area which is going to continue to grow, and I think continue to add value to many organizations, large and small. I think AI could be the thing which forces organizations to think entirely differently about identity and identity security. So, Matt, thank you for taking some time out. Thank you for everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.